So this is talking with Susan Ben just a few months after George's passing away. So Susan, start as we discussed. Who was George?
Well, George was a very special person. And I think really even where he was born was interesting, because his father was the headmaster of the large English-speaking Presbyterian school in Formosa. So he was born out there. At the time, Formosa was in Japanese hands. And he always joked that he was born in Formosa because he wanted to be close to his mother at the time. But they left Formosa when he was 4 years old and came back to the United Kingdom because his father had what they call long furlough, which means that he had a long leave about every 5 years. And they then joined George's much elder sister in England and had a happy family holiday in Bebington in the Wirral in the middle of England before his father went back to go on teaching in Formosa, and George and his mother stayed in England because George had to go to school. And at school, he went to, first of all, a school up in Bevington, and then he went to Eltham College in London, which was a school particularly supported for missionaries' sons. And from there, he was evacuated down into Taunton, which is in Somerset, and far away from the centre of the war at all, far away from the bombing. The children were all safe down there. And his mother went and lived down there temporarily as well. And that was when George did his main agricultural work, as he said. He grew cabbages and cauliflowers for England on an allotment. And I think actually that's probably the last time he did any gardening, because certainly in the time that I was married to him, he never did any gardening except for trees, and he liked growing trees. So every time we planted a tree in our garden in Hartley Whitney, it was in memory of something. So we have a Corsican pine tree, which reminds us of our holidays in Corsica. And we have another pine tree which came from Mont Saint-Aiguille in France, which was climbed in the 13th century at the command of the then king, who said to his army, when they were camped outside near the mountain, who said to his army, he said, "You will climb that mountain. I want to know what's at the top." And so they laid siege to the mountain. And in about 3 weeks, they managed to get to the top. Now, of course, it's a very favorite mountain for all sorts of small climbing expeditions, small groups of friends. Harish, I must stop. I can't go on speaking non-stop.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. You take your time, because we can always edit later on.
Yes,
so there's
I
no
think
problem.
you have to edit.
Yeah, no problem.
You think about
You take your time, talk slowly. There is no hurry at all.
If you ask me, how did George begin climbing?
That was what his first interest started with the Alps or the British Hills?
No, it was the Welsh Hills. And what happened was that in the latter days of the war, sort of just after the war, perhaps 46, 47.
He was not involved in war at all?
He wasn't in the war because he was born in 1929. So he was just too young to be called up by the end of the war, although he did do national service for 2 years in the army. But when he was at school in Taunton, he used to go up to actually to Manchester, where his uncle, who was an architect, was living for a holiday. And the way he travelled was to bicycle from Somerset to Manchester. And he was always intrigued by the Welsh hills, because he would have to bicycle up through the spine of Wales, as you might say, from south to north. And he loved the hills and loved looking at them. And at one time, I'm not quite sure of the year, but when he was about 17, just before he was called up for national service, probably the last holiday at school, he was bicycling to his uncle in Manchester, and he caught sight of a poster which was advertising a talk that evening by a group of climbers who had been climbing in Wales. And he thought he'd like to go to it. So he did. And he was just fascinated by the whole thing. And after the talk,
Which was this talk? I mean, on what subject?
On climbing in it was a group of climbers who had been climbing in North Wales.
Okay.
And wanted to share their enthusiasm and their experiences with a small audience.
Yes.
And that was the first time that George had looked at any pictures. They would have been still photographs probably in those days of the mountains, and had heard anybody talk about climbing, particularly climbing on ropes. And George was absolutely fascinated. He was spellbound by this talk. And he went up to the lecturer afterwards and said, "If I want to climb, how do I start?" And that was typical of George, you see, taking the initiative and just making the direct question.
Yes.
And the lecturer said, "Well, we are all going climbing tomorrow. If you want to come, you're welcome to come with us." And George said, "Well, how do I get there?" And he said, "Well, I think if you catch a bus, you'll get near enough to walk to us." So George did. He caught a bus, and then he had a 13-mile walk until he got to the base of the rocks that they were climbing on. And he arrived, I should think probably to their surprise, he arrived. And he said, "Here I am. Now, what do we do?" And the leader tied a rope round him and said, "Right, you just go up." So he led George up quite an easy climb. I think George called it a V-diff. A V-diff is a pretty easy category of climb, actually. Even I've done a V before now.
Yeah.
And George thought it was wonderful. And he was then able to do one more climb there. And then they all set off together to get back. And I don't know where they'd come from exactly. But they caught a train back from a slightly nearer point. And they sang all the way because they were a very musical group and loved classic music. And so they would sing the themes from the symphonies that they thought they were going to hear in the evening. And that was George's introduction to climbing, and he was hooked. He never looked at another sport.
Absolutely.
Which was interesting because at school, he had actually been a high jumper. And he had broken the school record. And indeed, he had jumped for the public schools of England in a national competition. He did something that was called the Fosbury flop, which I think is a very old-fashioned way of jumping now. But at the time, it was the latest method.
Yes.
And he had two great advantages. One, of course, were his long legs, but the other were his very long arms. All his shirts had to be made with extra long arms in order for them to fit him. And I think it was useful in climbing and useful in hugging a girlfriend or a wife as well. And so that was sort of who he was then.
So now, how did his climbing life progress? I mean, did he keep on climbing everywhere? In Alps?
What happened then was that he only had one day's holiday, between leaving school at 18, having taken his higher school certificate and got himself a place at Cambridge University. But before he was allowed to go to university, he had to do his national service, which was 2 years.
Now, this national service is what? I mean, basically, is to get trained in military aspects?
Yes, military training in either the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. It was an extension, really, of training for soldiers during the war to make sure that the UK always had trained military personnel. I mean, you know, the soldiers that they needed for any war. And it was what all young men had to do unless you were in an exempt profession. So he just had 1 day's holiday between leaving school and being called up into the army. And he did his basic training in, I think, somewhere in Salisbury Plain. I can't remember exactly where. But then he was sent. They said to him, if you want to do officers training, it was called a WASB. If you want to do that, name your preference of what part of the world you wanted to go to. So he said, well, first of all, my preference is the Far East, and then it will be the Middle East, and then it will be the Near East. And they sent him 100 yards up the road to Catterick in Yorkshire. So he was initially very disappointed about that.
Yes.
But Catterick was actually quite near the gritstone rocks of the Peak District. And he and friends managed to arrange with an officer that they should have the use of an army lorry for the weekends. And they had some rope. I suppose it was probably army rope as well. And they had some army rations and one of those things that just materialize. And they used to go off on a Friday evening and climb all weekend and come back on a Sunday evening. And so I suppose he was self-taught, because I don't think that there was anybody who had done what I would call rope work very much.
He had no formal training. He just learned climbing with others.
Just climbing with others, you know, whoever perhaps had extended his rock climbing a little bit could help the next one along. But that was his basic rock climbing experience, yes. And from there, he went, he climbed in Scotland, covered vast distances on a very ancient motorbike. I can't remember what make it is, but I think somebody else would be able to tell you that. And he had one or two spectacular smashes on the motorbike. But he and friends did manage to get to Scotland, and he's climbed quite a lot in Skye. He did the Coolin Ridge in Skye all by himself. Yeah. The thing about George was he was never afraid of going off by himself. He was never dependent on anybody else for company. He loved company, but he was perfectly self-sufficient. And so he got quite a lot of experience. Oh, and then he got a summer job up at Fort William in the steel mills there. And with that little bit of money, he was able to travel a bit more in Scotland. And then he went to Cambridge.
What subject did he study in Cambridge?
Geology. Yes, he'd always been fascinated by rocks. So that was the subject that he went up to Cambridge on, geology. But actually, I think it was sort of decided that he was more a general man than an out-and-out geologist. And so in the end, he did a natural sciences degree at Cambridge. But that is really another chapter, because he did that degree in two halves. One was before Everest and the other was after Everest, with a sabbatical in the middle of a whole year. So altogether, he managed to extend his university time at Cambridge to 5 years. Because having changed course, it became a 4-year course.
So this Everest came about while he was at Cambridge. So how did it all start?
While he was at Cambridge. And there again, everything that George achieved, he achieved by his own ingenuity and taking advantage of opportunities. And also a very good planning brain. He would say that he always reckoned that he minimalized risks by good planning. And I think John Hunt appreciated that.
But how did he come to know John Hunt?
No, we can't go to John Hunt yet. We have to give George a season in the Alps, first of all. In fact, 2 seasons in the Alps.
Yes.
Having joined the Cambridge Mountaineering Club, he did in fact become chairman of it, or president of the Mountaineering Club. But where his big opportunity, his big break, if you like, came, was that just before the long vacation in the summer that these universities have, he spotted, and nobody had any money at that time at Cambridge. No undergraduate was really rich then, and there was a break. There was just click off for a moment because I can't think of the word. There was a limit to the amount of money anybody could take out of England. £50 was all you were able to take. This was a government decree. And so most people could really only afford to go to the Alps, or indeed out of England, for a couple of weeks or so. Otherwise you ran out of money. But George spotted this advertisement of an American glaciologist who was fascinated by the makeup of the high mountains of the Alps, and offered to pay a couple of undergraduates who would go out and dig a tunnel in the side of Monte Rosa. And George persuaded a great friend of his, Roger Chorley, to go with him. And they went as volunteers to dig this tunnel and be paid, you see. And they had to hire local mountaineers to help them dig the tunnel. And they actually they had to climb a couple of thousand feet every day before they got to the tunnel and started their day's work. But they did give themselves days off, the weekends, so they were very fit. So by the time their weekends came, walking uphill 2,000 foot was no problem to them at all. And between them both, they set up a number of very fine climbs in the Alps, and a number of them were British guideless climbs. So although they weren't necessarily first descents, they were done without a guide, because up till that time, the vast majority of English climbers had always taken a guide with them. That was the natural way of doing things. You know, coming from England, you don't know much about the high mountains, so you take a guide to show you the way, and generally be an experienced mountaineer on the other end of the rope to lead the way. So when and also I don't know if it was the same summer or another summer, but I think it was another summer. George organised, as president of the Cambridge Mountaineering Club, he organised a university, an undergraduate camp to climb mountains in the Alps, and it was very well attended. It was very well organized, and the undergraduates had a great time there. They achieved a lot. And so when John Hunt advertised that he was looking for climbers for Everest, and all the mountaineering clubs around the country were canvassed, received invitations to put in an application.
I mean, was it by application?
Yes, by application.
Oh, good.
Yes, it was. You had to write in, if you like, with your CV to John Hunt in order to get an interview. And George was able to put in really quite an impressive number of climbs that he'd done in the Alps, and also to say that he had organized this camp, which had been such a success. So I think John Hunt saw that he had perhaps quite an unusual young man who would be well worth interviewing. And also, John Hunt always wanted to encourage young people. It was the most important thing in his life was really to encourage the young. So for him, it was important to take a couple of young climbers with him. And he chose one from Cambridge and one from Oxford, Mike Westmacott, who's 3 years older than George, as the youngest members of the party, and two climbers who had never been to the Himalayas before, but would were worth giving a chance to come on such a very special expedition. And so that's really how George got onto the expedition.
But was he involved in anything with Shipton versus Hunt? Who was the leader, who was not to be the leader?
No, George was never part of that discussion. No, that was entirely within the Royal Geographical Society. George had met Eric Shipton because by that time he was a member of the Alpine Club, but very much as a senior mountaineer of another generation, someone to look up to.
Yes.
You know, I mean, George had great admiration for Eric Shipton. And years later, when we were in Venezuela and already married, and Eric Shipton was on his way down to Patagonia to do one of his climbing treks down there, he actually called in at Caracas and he stayed with Douglas Busk, Sir Douglas Busk, who was the British ambassador to Caracas at that time and was also a member of the Alpine Club and was a very keen mountaineer. And Eric, as I say, stayed with Douglas and then came down to the oil patch where we were. We lived at that time in a little lakeside village called Lagunitas, which was in the middle of all the oil wells. If you've ever seen a forest of oil rigs, we lived among them. That was most of them were actually on the lake, and we lived below sea level, just the other side of the dike, which kept the water from flooding our houses. But we had an oil well pumping oil actually in our garden at the time. All the time we lived there. But anyway.
So what did George talked about Everest? What are his impressions and what were his sort of feelings? Did he enjoy the expedition? Was he part of the success?
Let me just finish this little story.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
Because Eric actually flew down to our oil patch, and George took him and half the engineers in the petroleum engineering department of Shell. He took them all up to Pico Bolivar, which was the highest of the Andes, Venezuelan Andes. And he took Eric with him, and they all went climbing up there, which went swimmingly as far as they were concerned. But I was a little nervous because George's boss, by Sunday afternoon, George's boss kept driving past our house to see if George had returned, because all his petroleum engineers were with George there. And he hoped he was going to see them again in time for Monday morning. And in fact, they'd had quite an excitement because they'd taken with them 2 Dutch petroleum engineers, great, big, hefty Dutchmen who had been rowing blues at Delft University. And because they were so fit and thought that they were so sporting and athletic, they thought they could climb mountains. And so George took them with him, and they did all right. They did very well. But unfortunately, one of the fixed ropes that was there at the top of Pico Bolivar broke. And George, luckily, doing all the right things at the right moment, managed to hold this man. Otherwise, there would have been a very serious, if not fatal, accident there. So from then on, George was quite a hero to these Dutchmen. Sorry, you wanted to go back. Anyway,
no, that's fine. That's fine. You carry.
Successful expedition.
No, you carry on.
Eric actually lectured to the all the people who lived in the camp. There were about 200 of us there living in the camp, and so everybody was very pleased to hear the famous Eric Shipton talk to us. And he's a delightful man with the most wonderful blue eyes. But such a delightful man. I loved having him as a guest. And the last nice little touch to that Andean expedition was a friend of George who he had been in the army with and had been part of the climbing group that had gone from Catterick to the Peak District every weekend, was at that time working for English Electric, and had been sent to South America and had managed to contact George. And remember, no mobile phones, no telephones, quite frankly. And so any news you had took a long time to arrive. But he knew George was going up to Pico Bolivar. He managed to catch a plane down to Lagunillas. No, he caught a plane to Merida, the capital of the Andes in Venezuela. He caught the teleferic, which there was one, teleférico in those days, up to the top. He missed the climb, but when they came down, there he was waiting at the top of the teleférico in his London suit with an umbrella over his arm. Quite ridiculous.
Yes.
But such fun. So,
yes.
Such fun. Oh, dear.
Oh, very nice. So we want to take a little break, or we continue?
I think we better take a little break. I'm going to have
Yes.
some water.
Part 2 of interview with Susan Ben on 28th of November 2011. So Susan, we had interrupted when George was selected for Everest.
Yes.
So now about Everest, his impressions, his going, his friends, whatever you want to talk about. Okay.
I think really the first thing to say is that for George, it was just a great adventure. I mean, it was the most marvelous opportunity to go to the Himalayas as a very young man and to go in the company of several distinguished mountaineers, and with the aim of climbing the highest mountain in the world, knowing that you have the best chance that the UK would probably ever have to achieve that objective, and to be with a party of very like-minded mountaineers, of course, like-minded climbers. Everybody had this tremendous goal in sight, but also to be under the leadership of a very remarkable man. And I think what probably stays in the mind of the climbers of that expedition is that everybody got on together. It there was no dissensions, there was no disagreements. John Hunt led a very united and very happy expedition. He was devoted to the Sherpas himself. He thought extremely highly of them. And within the expedition, they also had a couple of Gurkha officers who were used to being in the subcontinent, who had a high regard for the people there. And there was also the colonial aspect of Ed Hillary and George Lowe, who were very respected climbers because they had put up fine achievements themselves on Cho-Oyu and so forth the years before. And George, if you like, was the youngest and perhaps had the most to be modest about.
Yeah. What was his age that time, if I may?
He was 23 when he was chosen. He was actually 24 when they set sail from England. And as I say, it was the most marvelous adventure for him. He's been asked over and over again, did he have any regrets that he wasn't on the summit party? Did he expect to be on the summit party? I don't think he expected anything. I think it was so much a team effort. It was just great to be part of the team. And all his life, that was what he said. He never said anything different about that. He had a tremendous respect for the others and a fascination to hear about their adventures and to learn from them. And I think that was the great strength, that they all respected each other. And of course, when they actually got to Everest, they got to the base camp there, and John Hunt deputed Ed Hillary and George Lowe to go with George Band and Mike Westmacott to do the first difficult task of finding a way through that very dangerous bottom of the icefall. It was such a good move on John's part. I always think there was great wisdom there because he had two of the most experienced ice climbers in the expedition, taking with him the two youngest who had never been in the Himalayas before, but who were probably, who certainly were good rock climbers and had everything to learn. And they forged themselves into a very successful little climbing group, which actually did open up the way up the icefall.
And who was he was most pally with, say, for example, on this expedition? He had some special friends with he shared more bonds than others?
No, I don't think he did. I think this was all part of the success of the expedition. There were no factions, so far as I ever heard.
No, I mean, not factions, but say more of a friendly.
No, I think partly they were also busy, of course, and also the partnerships changed depending on what was the next step in the climbing of the mountain and who could do what. I mean, sometimes you had a couple of climbers forging the way ahead, and then you had days, if not weeks, of other climbers escorting the Sherpas with all their heavy burdens across the crevasses and up the tremendous ice blocks that they had to sometimes take ladders to. That was dangerous work. And they didn't always share the same tents with the same person. So I think there was the opportunity, at least this is what I always felt and understood from George, was there was the opportunity to get to know each and every one of the other climbers. It was a mix and match, as you might say.
And what height did George personally reached on this trip?
George personally reached, I think he always says that it was 24,000 foot it was the top of the Lhotse face that he got to. He didn't actually go to the South Summit. I think he got a bit of flu and was sent down to base camp for a couple of days. So perhaps it would have been different. I mean, he would have been allocated different tasks if he hadn't had to go down. But I mean, he came up again and performed strongly. And that, of course, stood him in very good stead when he went to Kangchenjunga.
Yes.
If you like, Everest was his proving ground more than anything. And I think probably it proved beyond doubt that he was a very good man to have on a climb with you, which must have been one good reason why Charles Evans chose him to go on Kangchenjunga, because George was the only climber who was on Everest who actually went with Charles Evans to Kangchenjunga. I mean, that was probably happenstance. The others were all busy or whatever. You know, I have no idea. But I just know that George was the only other ex-Everester that went with Charles. Again, for whom he had amazing respect and admiration. And was very much a leader with the same philosophy as John Hunt. That you use everybody and you use them when and where they are good at it. You make sure that you run a happy team. You make sure that the Sherpas are properly looked after. And I mean, there was a Sherpa on Kangchenjunga that got snow blindness. And certainly I know George looked after him very well. And George also, on Kangchenjunga, George had a personal Sherpa called Tashi. And we met Tashi. I couldn't believe it, in the most amazing coincidence in Kathmandu in 1960. I think it must have been 1969. It was my first visit to Kathmandu. And by that time, they actually had a flight that went into Kathmandu. So you didn't have to walk in from India. And we at the time were living in what is now called Bangladesh, but at that time was called East Pakistan. It was when there was East and West Pakistan before they split. And we had gone up there with our eldest son, Nigel, who was aged 4 at the time, for a little bit of a change from the very trying climate that we lived in down near in Chittagong in Bangladesh. And we were staying at the old Royal Hotel, which was a wonderful hotel. The Royal Hotel was the home of the original Yak and Yeti bar there, and was possibly the only hotel in Kathmandu at the time, or only hotel of any standard. We had a bar. Our bathroom was as big as our bedroom. I suppose they just put a bath in another bedroom, and there were no bells or telephones or anything like that, but you had a wonderful chowkidar outside your bedroom door, wearing the most immaculate uniform with a cocked plume to his turban, and he answered the bell. He did everything for you. And as I say, we had the Yak and Yeti bar there, and anyone who came to Kathmandu went to the Yak and Yeti bar. So it was lovely for George, because immediately we were there, we were meeting climbers again. But sorry, why did I introduce that?
Because of
Tashi,
Kangchenjunga and Tashi, yes.
That's right, yes. One of the days we were in Kathmandu, there was a procession of presents from, I think, the groom to the bride, or would it have been the bride to the groom? I'm not sure which way round.
Groom to the bride.
The groom to the bride, going to the king's palace there, because the king's son was being married. And in fact, they came on elephants. There was an elephant procession. And as you can imagine, there were crowds en route watching this amazing sight. And suddenly there was a cry from George, and immediately from a Nepalese who was there, and they flung their arms round each other. And it was George's personal Sherpa on Kangchenjunga, Tashi. Can you imagine that we actually met him in the middle of a crowd in Kathmandu? How many years later? 14 years later.
14 years later, yes.
Quite astonishing. But George was so chuffed to see him.
So after this Everest and Kangchenjunga, how did he handle fame? He was now a very famous person. Met the Queen and...
he was certainly in demand for lectures.
Yes.
He was always deemed to be a very good lecturer. But when he came back from Everest, as I said, he had to resume his university career. If we go back to 1953. And he just did the one expedition to Kangchenjunga, and he did 2 long vacation expeditions as an undergraduate. One was to Rakaposhi in the Karakoram. They didn't that was an undergraduate expedition that was just got together by a bunch of friends and led by a Swiss called Alfred Tissier. And they drove a Bedford truck across the Middle East out to base camp at Rakaposhi, and 4 of them drove out and 4 of them drove back, and they managed to crack the sort of nub of the problem of Rakaposhi, which was called the Monk's Head, but they didn't get further than that. Incidentally, that was another salutary lesson on climbing, and another one where George managed to save a chap's life, because on one of the knife-edge ridges of Rakaposhi, the classic thing happened whereby a cornice of snow gives way, and 2 people fell down the cliff on one side, and George and it wasn't a Sherpa there, but it was a Karakoram climber, a native climber. They jumped down the other side of the cliff, so that you had a pendulum of 2 climbers on either side. And eventually, I mean, thank God, the rope didn't break. And eventually they managed to rescue the 2 that had fallen down several hundred feet. But it's a classic example of, if you take the right precautions and you play it by the book, then luck will help you, and you rescue a situation that might have been a tragedy. Anyway, he drove back from that, and it was a very happy expedition. They had various adventures in the Bedford truck. I may say George hadn't passed his driving license at that time, but that doesn't seem to worry anybody. And they actually managed to sell the Bedford truck for as much as they paid for it in the beginning when they got back. But that was one of the expeditions. And then he went to Peru, and he went with another group of friends. This time it was led, I think it was led by Jack Tucker. Certainly Jack was on the expedition there. And Mike Westmacott was on it. And I can't remember who the others are at the moment. And they went to climb a mountain in Peru called Pumasilla, where there are a lot of mountains in Peru. And I think probably some of them look quite like each other, because they did climb a mountain. In fact, they climbed 2 mountains, but they never did get to Pumasilla. They lost their way, and so they didn't climb Pumasilla. But with the information that they gathered, they paved the way for Simon Clark, who was another Cambridge undergraduate, a little bit younger than George, the next generation, as you might say. to go out the following summer, and they did climb Kumasiya.
Mm.
So George had that climb, and it was lovely because they went out by boat and they came back by boat. So I think most of it was sort of drinking wine in the ships, and then a bit of climbing. It was lovely. And they went to Cusco and did a bit of sightseeing and made great friends with their two guides there. I can't remember their names, I'm afraid, at the moment. And then the last, if you like, of the big mountains that he climbed was again with John Hunt in 1958 when they went to Russia. They went to Caucasus. They got permission to climb in the Caucasus, and this was before Perestroika. And George and one of the Russian climbers, because they had some Russian climbers with them. I think that was probably part of the bargain, that everything was politically correct. George said that he learned a lot from the Russian climbers. They had a different technique and a different attitude, but they were very, very professional and very dedicated to any climb that they embarked on. And the two particular climbers that came with them were what they call masters of sport. In other words, they'd done an apprenticeship in mountaineering. They passed various grades, like taking a driver's test, and they were now allowed into the big mountains. And George and what is his name? What's his name? It's not going to come to me. Anyway, they climbed Dichtau, which was a very fine climb, and one other mountain there. And George also got to know a Russian interpreter, because every group of non-Russians that went to Russia always had to have an official interpreter with them. Well, for practical reasons, but also he had a political role, called Eugene Gippenreiter. And did you ever meet him, Harish?
No, I didn't know.
No. Such a likable man. An absolute star. I'll show you a photograph of him. He and his wife came and stayed a couple of times with us here, actually, years and years later. But that was the last big expedition that he did before he started work with Shell, because his father, who was a clergyman, he was an English Presbyterian minister, and as I say, he'd been headmaster of this school in Formosa, Taiwan, and had built it up from a school of about 60 boys to 600 boys, and introduced rugby there as well, so the game of rugby. So he was quite a man, and he said to George, now give yourself a few years if you want to do your climbing, but after that you've got to get yourself a proper job. So at the age of 27, George did apply to Shell and got himself a proper job as a petroleum engineer in Shell.
Now, I said this time, George was a famous person with Kangchenjunga and Everest. So how did he wear his fame? Was he, because a lot of people like, say, Tenzing and others have found it very difficult to remain the same persons after being famous. So,
well, I don't think George was famous like that.
Well, he was, after Kanchenjunga's first ascent and
yes,
Everest.
But the thing about Kangchenjunga was that they were never meant to climb it. That expedition was a reconnaissance expedition.
But still, it was
in force. And when they came back, it was, after all, only the third highest mountain in the world.
Still, but
and there simply wasn't the same fuss made. There really wasn't. Charles Evans was very low key, and they had been very careful. They'd learnt their lesson from Everest. Very careful to make sure that the fact it had been climbed was the important thing. That those particular named members of the party were not the most important thing about the achievement.
Mm.
So it was much lower key.
Mm.
And although, of course, within mountaineering circles, it was a very fine achievement, and George and Joe Brown, who very much complemented each other and their different skills, everybody knew what an achievement it was. It wasn't something that caught the eye of the press particularly. So it just wasn't the same.
Yeah. So now, where did you come in the picture? When did you meet George? And yes,
I had to wait until there were no mountains to compete with.
So after his shell job, you came in the picture.
I met George in The Hague in Holland, the Netherlands, when he was sent to The Hague as a petroleum engineer trainee, and at that time Shell trained all their petroleum engineers in Holland. That was the technical headquarters of the Shell. And I was at the time out there in the embassy, the British embassy there. And as young people do, you know, when you're in a foreign country, you sort of gravitate together, you're introduced to each other, and we moved around in the same group of young people for a few months. And as I say, George didn't have any mountains to go to. So really, there wasn't anything else he could do except look for a wife, was there?
What were you doing in Holland?
No, I was in the embassy.
Embassy? Oh.
Yes, the British embassy.
British
there.
embassy.
I had learnt Dutch. I'd learnt German at school, and I'd lived in Germany for a time. And when I went to the... No, not when I went to the Foreign Office. Oh, and I worked in London for a time in the Foreign Office. And then they said they'd like to send me to Holland if I was willing to learn Dutch. And with all the arrogance of youth, I said, well, I've learnt German, so I expect I could learn Dutch. So I went to the Berlitz School of Languages and learnt Dutch. I also had a great affinity to Holland because we knew a Dutch sea captain and his family there very well from the war. And so I liked the idea of going to The Hague. And I used to do some translation work, not from English to Dutch, but simply from Dutch to English.
So that's where you met George. And when were you married?
I met George.
And when were you married? Very soon?
Yes, we were actually. In fact, it's absolutely horrifying to think how little we knew about each other when we got married. I remember, you see, I'd never met any mountaineers before. And when I was told that George had been part of the Everest team, I had to think what that meant, first of all. And then I was slightly, not exactly horrified, I was slightly embarrassed that I wouldn't know what to talk to him about because I didn't know anything about mountains. In fact, we never did talk about mountains. And so by the time we got engaged, and in fact, by the time we'd married, I'd only met one of his mountaineering friends. So I still didn't know anything about mountains when we got married. And I remember being rather surprised that the Dutch papers wanted to interview us when we got engaged. And they came to, I don't know where they came to or where we met. I can't remember now, probably a hotel. And they took a photograph. And before they came, George really thought ahead, you know. He said to me, he said, they may ask you if I'm going to go on climbing. So I would just say, I don't know. Yeah, so he was keeping his options open, wasn't he? To me, that was a funny question because I couldn't imagine why he'd want to go on climbing. So it really was rather an extraordinary situation. It's almost a marriage which shouldn't have worked, I think, looking back on it, because I'd never even walked uphill before. I didn't possess a pair of flat shoes. All my shoes were 8-inch spiked shoes. Not 8-inch, sorry, 4-inch heels. I it had never occurred to me one walked anywhere, I don't think. My family didn't. I'd always lived on the banks of the Thames, up and down from Greenwich right up to Lechlade. And I really didn't know anything about it. But George had joined Shell then, and I knew other people in Shell. I think that was the way I looked at it, probably. And we were married in England, and at my family church at Remenham near Henley-on-Thames, which actually happened to be John Hunt's a family church as well. And I knew John Hunt before I knew George, because we'd met. But I don't think we'd ever talked about climbing. Well, I think he would have only talked to my parents, probably. And then we were immediately sent to the States. As far as I was concerned, I thought it was rather exciting going travelling. I think that was the way I looked at it, probably.
So when did you then return to England after your different postings? So finally to settle down.
Well, I thought we had settled down in England in about 1978. No, earlier than that, 1977 probably. But then George, and we bought Cedar House during that time. But then George was asked to go to Sarawak in Malaysia for another posting, one-year posting. So we actually, we went there for 2 years. So it wasn't until 1980, to the beginning of 1983.
Okay. And you are in the same house here?
Yeah, we kept the house. We came back here. But I mean, we'd gone to other places. We'd gone to the States and Venezuela, and then Bangladesh, and then the Sultanate of Oman, and then The Hague. We lived in The Hague again. 3 times we lived in The Hague. And then Sarawak. That's right. Yeah.
So now, if we talk as George as an administrator, so after he came in, he was involved with the Alpine Club. I know he became a president. So what all did he do, and how did he enjoy doing all that? Because he influenced a lot of people and a lot of clubs and reorganization of the club and everything.
Yes. Yes, when George became president of the Alpine Club, he was also Director General of the United Kingdom Offshore Operators Association, UCOA. So he actually had a very busy job as a spin-off from Shell. He was still in the oil business at the time. And I think it stretched him really quite thin to be president of the Alpine Club at the same time. But it was such an honor for him to be invited to do it. And he wanted to do it so badly that he said yes, he would. And when he took over, the Alpine Club was in South Audley Street. And the debate was to where should they move. They had to move because the lease for the building in South Audley Street was coming to an end. So they needed to move. And there was some movement, in fact, there was quite a strong movement to suggest that London should no longer be the focal point for the Alpine Club, and that many of their members actually lived in the north or in the Midlands or even in Scotland, and that it should move its headquarters to the Midlands. And I remember the debates very well and the passionate feelings there were as to whether it should stay in London or not. And I can remember very well a man called A.B. Hargreaves, who was a absolute pint-sized climber. Wonderful man. He was an Alpine Club member of many, many years' duration, and a passionate supporter of the Alpine Club. And I can remember when there was a lot of debate about who wanted to go down to London and how difficult it was to get there and back and so forth, that he stood up, all 4'6" of him, at the age of about 80, and said, well, personally, he went down to the Alpine Club every Tuesday for their meetings, and he couldn't see any difficulty about it whatsoever. And after that, there was no more debate. Somehow it collapsed. So anyway, George was tasked with finding another home for the Alpine Club. And they toyed with the idea of joining with the RGS or finding a home within the RGS premises, developing the back of the garden of the RGS premises. But in fact, it proved very difficult. The planning side alone was going to be a nightmare. So they eventually abandoned that, and they were offered this place in Charlotte Road, which is near Liverpool Street Station in a completely different part of London, but quite convenient for those coming from the north anyway, went into Liverpool Street or St Pancras and so forth. And I think this has proved the right move. They were more modest premises in many ways, but the Alpine Club got actually more square meters for their money there. And it was an up and coming, or deemed to be an up and coming area. And I think it has proved itself. Also, what was very important was that there was more room for the Alpine Club Library to expand. And the Alpine Club Library is a very fine library indeed. And has been able to rearrange itself and in fact put itself on a much better business footing since it got there. It has also, and this was Mike Westmacott's work, Mike Westmacott started the Himalayan Index, which was a computer-based index, which was a totally new concept when it was started in the 19... Gosh, I've rather lost my years now. I think it's
that doesn't matter.
Now.
Yes. Was George involved in that project? Himalayan Index?
Not directly. Not directly, but no, Mike took this over single-handedly. I mean, he did a fantastic job. But at the time, George was president, so of course he was closely involved, as you might say, from that point of view. And also, the whole, as I say, the library blossomed there, and George helped to develop a photo library also, and put the library on a much better business footing, and did a very successful piece of fundraising for the library, so that in fact it became self-supporting and was bringing in income for the Alpine Club. So that was quite an important step.
Yes.
Yeah.
So now if you say take George as a writer, author, so where did he created his work? In this room, basically?
Yes, he did. No, he wrote here entirely.
Was it to type on computers or handwritten?
He hand wrote everything.
Hand wrote. Okay.
He preferred to write everything, the first draft. He had a lovely friend who came and acted as a secretary for him, a remarkable lady who managed to read his writing, which is something I never could do. And between them, they got it out in really quite quick time. It wasn't so much the writing that took all the time. It was the photographs, because first of all, you had to decide what photographs you wanted, and then you actually had to find out where the owner of the photograph was. And in a climbing world, they could be absolutely anywhere in the world,
Mm.
on the top of a mountain for the next 6 months, or
Mm.
totally out of touch. And that's what took the time
Mm.
in that book.
And how many books he produced? Approximately?
Well, he wrote Road to Rakaposhi.
Mm.
So
Yes.
that after that expedition, so he did that one, and then he did a chapter in the Red Snows, which was the one to the Caucasus.
Caucasus, yes.
Yes, and then he did Everest. That's
Mm.
right, that book, and then Summit,
Mm.
which was the history of the Alpine Club. So those are the ones that he's done.
Mm. Yeah, all books turned out to be one of the very major contributions to the mountaineering history.
Yes, they were. Well, certainly the last two were.
Mm.
Yes.
And any other field that he involved himself, like any charities, local issues?
Well, yes, because he took over the Himalayan Trust,
Mm.
the presidency or the chairmanship, it is, of the Himalayan Trust from George Lowe,
Mm.
the UK Himalayan
Mm.
Trust, and he has worked very hard for that. And in fact, he inaugurated the Ed Hillary Memorial Lecture every
Mm.
year,
Mm.
which is their major fundraising vehicle.
Mhm.
But also, he led 10 treks to the Himalayas. And there was always a charitable aspect there.
Mm.
And also very much getting to know the Sherpas better, and making friends with the local population. And two of the treks that I went with him on, well, in fact, I went on most of them, not all,
Mm.
were to the base camps of Kangchenjunga, both the south one and the east one, and over the Laki Allah. And the second time that we went, which was at the height of the Maoist rebellion,
Mm.
and we were lucky that we were given a safe passage through the Maoist territories there. But that, I think, was due to George's name. And we found that the villagers came to us as we went through these poor villages which had suffered very much from the rebellion.
Mm.
And George was, first of all, welcomed, said, you came back to see us, that's lovely. But now can you help us? Because we really need help with our schools, in the same way that Ed Hillary
Yes.
helped the Sherpas in Solakumbu. And so by that time, George was chairman of the Himalayan Trust in England. And so now this Himalayan Trust has as its major project the funding and improvement of schools and teaching in the Taplejung area there. And George and I visited Lele, which is the headquarters of the teacher training project, 2 years ago at its inaugural training session, which was a wonderful thing to be able to do. And then, of course, George started the Reged project, which was the Mountaineering Museum outside Penrith, just off the M6 there. And that was very successful for some years, but it has proved that it's a little bit too far out for a permanent museum there. So they will look for another venue for that. But also the Mountain Heritage Trust, which is a very interesting project, which is exactly what it says. It is to promote the heritage that we have in this country for mountains. And I'm glad to say that it's in very good hands at the moment, because Julie Somerville, who is the great niece of Henry Irvine, who was on Everest in 1924, it was, wasn't he? She is now the chairman of that, and a very fine person in her own right. He also was chairman of the BMC for some time. He went in as a sort of, was asked to do a caretaker job because they lost their chairman. No, that's a president. Sorry, the president of the BMC. And the Mountain Training Centre in Brennan in North Wales is part of the umbrella, comes within the BMC umbrella. And George managed to put them on a much better financial footing to hammer out an agreement with Sport England that they should get an annual income and agree a set of principles how that should be done. So really, in many ways, he sort of contributed in a sort of
back to the entire field where it came from. So of this rich and very fulfilling life, now can you just talk about his last illness very briefly, and how he was in that time, and what was his feelings?
No, you can never talk to George about that sort of thing. He was very self-contained. I can tell you the facts. The facts are that he had a mild heart attack when he was climbing Munros in Scotland in 2007, and shortly afterwards he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, which they managed to keep under control for a couple of years, and things deteriorated this last 6 months. But he still managed to go out to Kangchenjunga for the festivities of the 50th anniversary of Ed Hillary founding the first school there. And that was his sort of last big event.
Yes.
And he also managed to chair the Himalayan Trust fundraising talk on the 9th of June here, and then he really did get a lot weaker, and he died on the 26th of August.
And he's
but he died at home. He died at home, and he'd been at home, as I say, where he was in hospital very, very little at all. And I think the fact that he had managed to make that 50th anniversary reunion in celebration in Kangchenjunga, and also the celebration that the Sherpas themselves ran in Kathmandu, which Angrita, of course, was a great part of. I think he felt fulfilled.
Yeah. So it was a nice, peaceful end. So thank you, Susan, for covering up a life of a great man for us.
And I don't know what you'll make of it.
Yes, this will remain a major record for us, and I'm sure someday in posterity people would recount in your wonderful things. Thank you very much, Susan.
Pleasure.